You have about 30-second elevator pitch. Why people should pick up your bottles.
If you like American whiskey, if you like old American whiskey and you don't like that overly bitter finish, you're going to love our whiskey. And you're going to get older whiskey that's well made at a price that you just otherwise won't find.
I talked to Nick and Sam from Found North Whiskey about what makes Canadian rye so special. I get schooled in chemistry. And I find out what does it take to become Macallan's Master Distiller. All of that and more after the intro. Thanks everybody for joining us today. My name is Michael. I'm the co-founder of the Prime Barrel, where we select single barrels one at a time. The most important thing for us is really two things. It's the taste, behind the barrel or what's inside the barrel. And then the second thing is getting to know people behind the brand, behind the whiskey. And as such, we're joined today by Nick and Sam from the Found North Whiskey. Interesting story about the whiskey. I'm not going to steal their thunder. They'll tell you a lot about what they're all about themselves. But just right up front, I can tell you this much. I've tasted the whiskey. Probably most of you have too. And it's really, really amazing. Which is why we're having both of them on the cast today. This is going to be a good opportunity for everybody to get to know you guys better. So welcome.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
We start a little bit with you telling guys a little bit about yourselves. How did you get into the whiskey world? What made you join it? And then we'll transition into, your move to Canada and everything that the brand stands for. So Nick, why don't we start with you?
Yeah. Well, I got into whiskey, years ago now. And I think one of the main reasons I got into it was I'm kind of obsessed with the history of whiskey in general, and I feel like whiskey connects people in a way that's unusual, that you don't really find in a lot of other industries. And I think visiting distilleries when I was younger and more of just a hobbyist and not really a professional in the industry, one of the things that always blew me away was the tenure of how long some of the people working in not the highest up jobs. You go to Kentucky and these guys have worked the mash tun for 38 years. You know what I mean? And you're just like, wow, it's really a cool thing in today's world. And I think that was the first thing that drew me to it. And that plus I love the way it tastes. So simple as that. That really got me into it. And it kind of just, I went down the rabbit hole and I never came back up.
Sam, what brought you into this world?
Before I joined these crazy Taylor brothers, I was the brand ambassador for the Macallan in the Northeast of America, and I loved diving into the deep details of single malt Scotch. I think it was really the whiskey that got me interested in the nuts and bolts. American whiskey is what I grew up drinking, and I kind of took it for granted. But then Scotch whiskey, that's where the education came in.
Yeah.
With Macallan, I was working with Martinetti, so on the distribution side.
Okay.
And then before that, I was bar managing. And way back when I was, 14 years old, I was washing dishes in a kitchen. And it doesn't take a lot of hours working in dish pit to realize that the funnest job is actually the bartending, which is I tried immediately to get to bartending, because not only do you get to make drinks, you get to talk to people.
Correct.
What got me out
He's a psychiatrist without the degree.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And a philosopher, you don't even have to be right. You don't have to give good advice. You just gotta give any
people
advice.
Pay
it's
other
fine.
people to listen to them. Like, think about it for a second. People pay other people to listen to them, which means they don't get enough of that at home, right? You're providing it for free, and you're providing a nice little shot to go with it. So.
It's why I love eating at sushi bars, because you actually get to talk to people that make food.
Yeah.
Whenever you go to any good restaurant, you don't get to talk to the chef.
That's right. That's right. Unless you're Larry David. I'm not sure if you guys are fans of Curb Your Enthusiasm. Unless you're Larry David, and then of course you get into a shouting match with the cooks, but that's neither here nor there. So, like, for people that don't know, like, Sam we have quite a relationship with Sam. Like he's been coming to our retail shops before, and he is truly a whiskey geek. And I don't throw that term lightly. There are a lot of different people that come in through the shop and claim to be one. And then after a couple of questions, you understand that, nah, that's just not there quite yet. Sam, on the other hand, can teach us things about whiskey, which is actually a good segue into your own brand. So like talk to us about, Found North. Clearly there is a connection to Canada. So why don't we start there?
Michael, when we first started this company, we started it really as an importing company, and as we did a lot of brand ambassador work and representing other brands. But the intention was always to start our own brand. And we started traveling in 2016. We went to Scotland. In 2017, we went to Kentucky. We went to Japan. We started getting things shipped in from all over the world from different distilleries. And we were constantly looking for really interesting. We were looking for really good liquid, obviously. I mean, that's one of the sort of first steps and kind of the liquid value relationship, right? Like it's great if you find something amazing, but if it's absurdly priced, then it's not something we were that interested in. I think when we finally settled on Canada, we were really blown away by how good the ryes that were coming out of Canada were. And the thing that we realized was that people didn't even realize they were drinking rye from Canada. There are a lot of brands that are American brands, but really it's rye that they're not being as upfront about as that it's coming from Canada. And there were a lot of misconceptions around Canadian whiskey in general that we were subject to, that we were culprits of ourselves. And so we just sort of took a shot on tasting some of the things that were available to us. My brother got connected with a few of the master blenders in Canada, and we started tasting some of these old ryes. And we realized not only was there an opportunity to make really great whiskey at a good value, at really good value, which I mean, it's just fundamentally an important thing. But we realized as we learned so much more about how Canadian is made and its history, there was such a great opportunity to share that knowledge and understanding with other people. And I think that's probably one of the most exciting parts of the industry is, for us, it was like, why go to Kentucky or Indiana, make something that already exists on the marketplace. And really there's just not that much space for people who are not only whiskey drinkers, but explorers of the category. Right. The people who are looking for not just a whiskey they like, but a whiskey that actually makes them reconsider the category as a whole, makes them think about, wow, how is this made? Why does this taste the way it does? So much of the marketplace is so mature these days that there's not very much room for nuance, right? Like you can maybe do something with casking or proofing or a little bit here. Canada was just wide open. And when we started sourcing and blending whiskeys from Canada, we were flattened by how good they were. And not only that, it was also, I don't want to say unexpected because like it's an old famous industry. Honestly, from 1865 until 2010, the number one most consumed whiskey in the United States was Canadian. In that time up until today, on this continent, Canadian in terms of volume is by far the number one on this continent, which was mind blowing to us because we're just, where is it and who's drinking it and why?
Yeah, I mean their component and not only like outside of like a flat out Canadian brands, the components of Canadian rye is present in a lot of American brands. I mean, I can name you a dozen right off the top of my head, and more specifically, and this might come off as a shameless plug, but we've just picked a barrel of Rye 3, which is a blend of 3 ryes, and one of those blends, I think, is like a 16-year-old Canadian rye, which gives that whiskey a unique taste. So I don't want to steal your thunder, but I totally get what you're saying.
That's it. No, you nailed it. That's it. It was such an opportunity to make great whiskey. And for us being upfront about where it was from and why we were making it and what's in it, was not only, it wasn't just about transparency. It's about revealing the world of Canadian whiskey to people. And that's, and that's really exciting. And I mean, it's really, really fun for us. Sammy and I have been doing the blending, and it's just, every time we get introduced to some new component, or we start playing with some of these whiskeys, it just, the potential is just, it's unbelievable.
So you've said something very interesting. You said that, you know, it was interesting to you guys to understand why Canadian whiskey tastes the way that it does, and not just Canadian, or really any indigenous grain that, right, tastes the way that it is. So like, what parallels? Well, first of all, what did you learn? What makes Canadian whiskey taste the way that it is? And what differences, if any, have you noticed between American rye and Canadian rye?
It's the game changer. Honestly, it's the thing that doesn't just want us to bottle a couple Canadian whiskeys and move out. We created a brand for a reason, because we believe in Canadian whiskey and the process that allows us to create amazing flavors. The major difference, of course, being that there are no mash bills used in Canadian whiskey. They ferment, distill, and mature all their whiskeys separately. So you get to create your own canvas. It's incredible. I think there's a misconception, which is wholly founded entirely on one's experience with what whiskey is nearest to you. You know, I grew up again drinking a lot of bourbon and a lot of American rye, and it's burned into my memory. But just like when you learn a new language, tasting Canadian rye contextualized for me what I liked about American rye, and maybe what else there was, and not just rye, but what corn can do, what wheat can do, what barley can do. I would say that a lot of if you ask someone on the street, what does rye taste like in America? They'll say it's spicy.
Spice, yeah.
All that spice.
Yeah.
Where in fact, if you taste some of the things that Nick and I have tasted, 100% rye, distilled in a cooler climate, in reused oak, not very active oak. It's not just black pepper and vanilla. You're getting herbaceous flavors. You're getting fruit flavors, like stone fruit that you would only imagine ever coming from single malt. Wild things that also still need to be kept in check, balanced. That's the other side of whiskey made in Canada. In America, when you throw all the grains together, you make your mash bill, and you distill it. It's pretty much it's done. You throw it in a barrel, it's done. The cake is. Whereas in Canada, I would never want to drink a single barrel that had not been blended at some point, because it's not ready yet. The job has only begun at that point.
The power that you get from Canadian, from blending Canadian, is you have an enormous amount of control because of exactly what Sammy's talking about. In terms of there's this misconception within the whiskey community that whiskey is all about grain plus wood equals whiskey, right? But the oxidative process is so incredibly important. And so oftentimes people will say, well, they put it in used oak for 20 years, and that's the same as if you put it in new oak for 10 years. And it's not. It's not, because we're not just taking what we can from the wood and taking what we can from the grain. There's this entire oxidative process that's very interactive. And so these stone fruits and these herbaceous flavors and these floral characteristics that you can get in some of these really overaged ryes that haven't been bombarded by new oak are developing all of these incredible fruit notes. I mean, when we made batch 3, it was funny because when we made batch 1 is such a spice bomb, and we really wanted to show off the dynamic spice palette that's available when you're using all of this variety of oak. But when we made batch 3, we wanted to kind of show the other side of some of the components that we were blending with. And we tried to make it as basically fruit forward as possible, because you just don't find very many fruit forward ryes. Sure, it has the spice backbone. It is still a rye. but it's really interesting to see just the concentration of these floral and fruit notes that are really only possible because we can use such a variety of oak species from an aging standpoint.
I couldn't agree more. Personally, when we select barrels, this is what we look for. We look for uniqueness. We look for something that
Yes.
identifies and makes that specific barrel different from others. And you're right, the backbone of our rye is always going to be spiciness, but what else is there? Is there anything else?
Yes.
I've tasted tons of ryes that are just, in blind tasting, they all taste the same or very similar, and the brand almost doesn't matter. But then there is one or two that really stand out because they're so different in a good way. And I think this is where your brand comes in, and not to be lost on people. And as Sam's showing off bottles, and I do want you to do that at some point, your first expression, your first batch was a 16-year-old rye. Like, it's not often that old of a rye comes on the market, one, and two, taste as good as it does, right? Because I think the predominant thinking in an industry was always, hey, rye doesn't really have to age that long. Like, I mean, I've tasted ryes of 2 years old that you wouldn't even know it. Like, it's just, okay, it was fine to drink. So like, you guys on the other spectrum of that. I mean, it's 16-year-old, and as we move on, it's just going to be older and older and older, right? Because I think you have several other batches, which is a 17-year-old expression and an 18-year-old expression. So I have two questions, like, rye that old, like, what makes it unique outside of the age? And also, as we move on and go into 2022 and in 2023, will you ryes be aged 1 year older every single year? So is it going to be 16, 17, 18, and so on?
Okay, so you just said something that was just music to my ears, which is this notion that rye shows really well young. And to me, that reminds me of, like, Sammy and I like working as a whiskey buyer at a liquor store. I was constantly exposed to the marketing messages that were coming not just from one brand, but from an entire category. And so for years, right, the big advantage that single malt Scotch had was it's so much older than everything else, right? You know, 12-year-old Scotch is ubiquitous, which is absurd when you think about it. It's been aged for 12 years.
Right.
When you start thinking about starting your own brand, you suddenly
Right.
realize how old 12 years actually
Oh,
is.
absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And so for ages, right, it was Scotch, the messaging from the Scotch industry was age equals quality. And then all of a sudden there was this huge Scotch boom, and they run out of age stocks, and you start seeing all these non-age statements, and the marketing message completely flips. They say age doesn't matter, right? Age doesn't matter. And it's like, what you end up realizing as a either an industry professional or just a serious hobbyist is a lot of times the general message has to do with availability. And so when rye, I mean, in 2010, there were almost no American ryes on the market. And so over the last 12 years, as rye has suddenly become popular out of nowhere, or seemingly out of nowhere, the messaging has been, well, rye shows its best when it's young. Well, is that because you only have young rye, or is that because it's actually true?
Right. Correct.
And so for us, coming out with the really old rye was exciting, and I think part of making batch one be a cask strength 16-year-old rye that showed such big spice notes was to kind of shatter the notion that rye spice shows its best when it's young. Rye spice shows its best as it evolves and starts to get really dynamic and doesn't just taste like black pepper.
Right.
And that was like, we wanted to layer as many different components of spice as we possibly could with batch one. We wanted people to taste it who are attracted to rye and we wanted those people to say, oh crap, like, I didn't know rye could have this much dynamism from a spice standpoint.
Yeah.
To answer your second question, the 16 to 17 year was serendipitous.
Okay.
It was the components that we had that we could make that were making the best whiskey we could.
Okay.
And for us, that's the we can talk about what we're trying to do from a branding standpoint, what we're trying to do from a messaging standpoint, teaching people about whiskey, et cetera, et cetera. When it comes down to it, when Sammy and I are in the lab blending, the only thing that really matters is how good is the liquid. And that's really it.
So
Yeah.
what do you look for? Like, when you do blend, like, what makes you step and say, this is it, we're good, we got it?
So I'll hand this over to Sammy, because Sammy's background as mixologist and a bartender has been really, really important for our company. Sammy is, I'm very like, I like this. This is what I like. And I very much tend to chase things that I'm drawn to. And whether Sammy's been forcing me to make cocktails, which I never used to do because I was like, why ruin the whiskey? But he educated me. But whether he's making cocktails or whether, and more importantly, when we start blending, Sammy is always like pushing the boundaries, constantly making me taste things and consider flavors that I just otherwise wouldn't. So I'll leave the answer to Sammy to really talk about what he's looking for.
Yeah, actually, I think 80% of it comes down to the nose. We're basing, like Nick, when we're blending, we have an idea of what we want to create, and we have the elements that we want to use, and we're really trying to figure out the ratios and make sure it's balanced. The reason why you'll never see a 100% rye whiskey from us is because you would hate it. It's
yeah,
you wouldn't like it. Honestly, you would say like, oh my God, this is so good. Oh my God, what happened? Because they can get quite bitter. Like what you gain with old rye is these incredible tertiary flavors, the rancio notes of like tobacco and leather, the things that make it feel like ancient and brooding. That's cool stuff. But also that's a lot of time in wood, and you need to make sure you're balancing that with some of the corn that we have. That's also in there playing around to give some body, some sweetness to cut that element. That said, I think a lot about what I learned when I was with Macallan, and the blended Scotch they make is Famous Grouse. They use a lot of Macallan in Highland Park, and I learned very early on in my career there that you can become a master blender. Anyone in the company you can try out to get on the team to be a blender. But here's the test: you walk into a room, there's a table. There's 5 bottles. Nick knows this because I've told it before. There's 5 bottles on the table. They're all unmarked. You're told that one of them is Famous Grouse and the other 4 are the components used to make Famous Grouse. You have a glass, or like a beaker and a dropper. You have 5 minutes to tell me which one is Famous Grouse and to recreate it using the other constituent.
Oh my God.
And you can't taste it. You can only use your nose.
So, all right, hold on. How many people try out annually and how many actually succeed?
It becomes more of a, I can tell you right now that I've tried it, and I was told that I was pretty good for an American.
That's such a British thing to say, right?
Specifically a Scottish thing to say, very Scottish thing.
Right.
It was not so much of a compliment as it was a grunt in my direction, but a lot of people in the company have tried it. It's more of like a parlor show to watch how hard it is to blend things. But what I was told from these guys is that you just know the second you smell it. Nick, I mean, you can tell me.
It's right.
It's so weird how when you blend it correctly, it just smells like things have created something entirely new. The only way I can compare it to is to a sport I'm terrible at, golf. In your hands when you hit the ball, it just all of a sudden it just pops off your hand.
It just comes together, yeah.
What did I do? I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm terrible at golf. I play Mario golf. I don't play real golf. I will tell you, it just comes together. But that comes from a lot of background in balancing flavors. From when I was bartending, I grew up with 2 parents that loved cooking, so I cook all the time, not from recipes, just off the cuff. Yeah. And it's just about balance at the end of the day. That's
I mean, that's art right there. Like I know firsthand. I'm lucky enough to have a spouse who is into it, and I know like what she's doing. She never has like a specific recipes. I mean, she might have a base or something, but it's always all creativity. And I think a lot of that goes into the blending as well. So I totally get it. Like I guess my biggest pet peeve with the nose or going only by the nose when we pick barrels is that I've nosed barrels before that were just fantastic. And then you try them and I'm like, what the hell? That doesn't like, because you can expect a certain flavor after nosing it. And then it's completely something else in a bad way. I'm like, oh, such a letdown. It happens.
Yeah. That part of it is really tricky because when we really first started making the blends, we would blend something, and what's wild about blending is you can take a whiskey that has these 5 dominant flavors and a whiskey that has these 5 dominant flavors, and when you blend them together, you don't get any of those 10 flavors.
Right.
And so, so what's very frustrating about the process is when you find something that you really like and it's a specific tasting note, it's almost impossible to preserve that note while still balancing out the mouthfeel, while still balancing out the finish, because as soon as you start tweaking one of the components, you're often going to lose a specific note. You won't lose the general character of the whiskey, but you'll lose a note. And so when we were first doing this, we were like, what tasting notes are you getting? What specific things are you finding? Okay, can we create that? Can we create this? And believe it or not, we actually went sort of more bird's eye view from there. And what we started doing was we started saying, all right, how are the top notes, right? Like, are we getting the florality and the fruit that we want from this while sustaining this mouthfeel or this finish or this? And we were looking much more at, does this have enough fat, right? I mean, very much more simple things. And then when we would be tweaking certain just 1 or 2 percentage points here or there, a lot of times what we were looking at was, are we preserving not a specific note, but are we preserving enough of this florality, this fruit that we want, while tweaking this piece of it that we feel like is out of balance? And in the end, it's almost a rediscovery, because in the end you finish getting it all balanced, and then you taste it and you're like, all right, what is it actually? Like, what does it actually taste like? And that was, I mean, honestly, that's how we ended on batch 2, which we never planned on making to begin with, which was this very corn forward whiskey. Was very much we were trying to balance it, and then all of a sudden we had a higher corn to rye ratio, and we had to sort of have a meeting and say, can we market this thing? Because it's not a bourbon, it's not a rye. Like, what the hell is it?
And technically, we could have legally called it a rye if we wanted to.
Could have legally called it a Canadian rye, but it was just too. At the end we were just like, let's just make the best whiskey we can, and it only sort of randomly ended up at roughly an 80-20 ratio corn to rye. But there was never like a plan of, hey, let's preserve this flavor. It was, we're tweaking it to get as much out of this blend as we possibly can, accentuate as much of what we like in this as we can, create balance everywhere else. And this is just where it ends up. And it's like, okay, is there anything we can do to this to make it better? No. All right, let's bottle it.
I'm actually glad you brought this up, because one of the things I wanted to make sure we get from today's call is that for people to understand and actually look at the mash bill of your products, because like when you look at traditional rye, especially like MGP's rye, right, there are very high rye content mash bills. Yours are quite different, and you don't make rye like exclusively. Like, to your point, you have a mash bill that is higher in corn. Technically cannot be called bourbon, but
Yep.
It's more on that side than it is on our rye side. So yeah, exactly. Those two on that.
Yeah,
so go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So the white label is always high rye. So always above 50% rye. And the blue label is always 50% above 50% corn. The interesting thing I'll say is one nuance of how Canadian and American whiskey are fundamentally different that tends to go underappreciated is the sugar content, or the starch content that will become the sugar content in corn, is much, much higher than rye. And the reason this is important is because the way you get alcohol is the yeast consumes the sugar, and then the byproduct is alcohol, right? So if there is more sugar available, you're going to get more alcohol from that sugar, right? So when you take something like a 51% rye and a 45% corn, right? Those mash bills exist. You're actually getting almost twice as much sugar from the corn as from the rye. And so when you ferment those grains together and your mash bill is the grain ratio, it's actually extremely deceiving from how much of the alcohol is coming from the corn versus how much of the alcohol is coming from the rye. You're actually still getting way more alcohol from the corn. It's still a corn dominant whiskey, even though the ratios technically are 51-45. With us, we're actually telling you the liquid ratios. So when we say something is 66% rye and 30% corn, what we're telling you is 66% of the liquid comes from rye and 30% of the liquid comes from corn, which would in US terms probably translate more to like an 85% rye, to be honest.
That's interesting.
So people drink our rye all the time and go, wow, this is only 66% rye, but it's so rye forward. And that's because it actually is, it actually is, literally. It's just what people are used to.
Thanks for the chemistry lesson. I didn't know. I didn't think I was going to get one this early in the morning, but I'm just kidding. This is great stuff, and I think like a truly true whiskey enthusiasts appreciate details like that. And so when they tasted it, they're like, "Oh yeah, that makes sense now." So I know I told you guys this, we're going to keep this short, but I feel like I'm sitting at, at Sam's bar and we just, shooting the shit, which is great.
I'll get you a glass. I got a glass for you.
I do want to wrap this up. Like, I want to be respectful of your time. Let's talk about two things at the end here. So what's the future for you guys? Like what's the 2-year plan, 5-year plan? Like, what do you guys see yourselves and the brand, next year, or maybe in a couple of years from now?
I think we're not going to stop doing batches. So we'll continue to, for us, the making the same whiskey over and over right now, at least to start, is not something we're super excited about. We're much more interested in really seeing what we can do with the ingredients we have, and that we've discovered and that we have access to, because the interesting thing is that at least the Canadian whiskey that comes into the US is not always the most dynamic stuff that they can make. It's rarely cast strength. It's often watered down and it's often filtered, and there's often additives and things like that. And that means that for us, we really have an opportunity to, as we like to say it, we like to make Canadian whiskey with an American whiskey drinker's mindset, right? And American whiskey drinkers really, they don't just have one drink and that's all they drink. They're excited to continue to explore the next thing. Right. And for us, we want to be ahead of that, right? We want to be like, hey, this is where we went. And the real whiskey explorers and whiskey geeks and whiskey enthusiasts, we're excited for them to come along with us. And so we'll continue to do batch releases. But at the same time, I think we have a few ideas about some sort of longer term projects in terms of creating a staple whiskey of Found North. And I think if we really find the right combination that is presenting something that is unique and really is just not well represented and not something that you can just go out and buy. And if we make something like that and people really enjoy it, I think we'll sort of chase that for sure.
Speaking about batches, I know you guys are up to batch 3 and 4. Those have been released yet or no?
Yesterday.
Oh, perfect timing. So I'll include some links in the description of this video where you people actually can get yours. There's plenty of stores that already carry it. We're happy to carry your product now as well. And as a cliffhanger, I'll let my people know that, hey, sometime in Q2 of next year, we'll probably collaborate with you guys on a single barrel selection, which I'm looking forward to. So like we've talked about everything. You have about 30-second elevator pitch. Why people should pick up your bottles?
If you like American whiskey, if you like old American whiskey and you don't like that overly bitter finish, you're gonna love our whiskey. If you're really that's and you're gonna get older whiskey that's well made at a price that you just otherwise won't find. And that should do it in and of itself. But if you're really interested in people like us who are just chasing every rabbit hole and exploring every nook and cranny of the whiskey industry and then trying to bring that to you, that's what we do.
That's great. That's awesome. And if my opinion counts for anything amongst, my club members, then I can vouch for that because I've tasted it and it's exactly that. So I thank you guys for your time today. I appreciate it. Hopefully we can do it again when we actually launch a barrel with you, and we'll talk about that specific barrel. But for today, thank you for joining me, and good luck with everything you guys are doing. I think you guys are doing a great work. Good luck and cheers.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks so much, brother.
See
Appreciate
ya.
it.